Good evening, welcome in RNQ Easino classes, block number 4, unit number 1, semantic holism and radical interpretation. 1.0 objectives. Hermeneutics poses serious problems for epistemology as traditionally conceived. The aim of this last block is to examine those challenges and see the newer direction epistemology has taken. The first unit of this exploration will introduce you introduce us to one of those major challenges and help us examine the seriousness of this challenge. The challenge is that the semantic holism, or the idea that individual words, that expressions have meaning only in a context and not independently. Analyzing this notion and its cousin hermeneutic circle, we shall also trace the limits of holism. In the course of this unit, we gain familiarity with key ideas such as holism and semantic holism, two dimensions of the hermeneutic circle, radical translation interpretation. 1.1 Introduction. Recent activities of epistemology is the name of an circle. The circle of a philosophy is the title of a book. Title of a book dealing primarily with epistemological issues. This gives us an idea of the despondency felt in philosophical circles about philosophy in general and epistemology in particular. All the heart of this crisis is the development of hermeneutics and the challenge it poses to the manner in which epistemology was done in the past. Richard Rorty, one of the most famous postmodern philosophers of the 20th century, put the matter in this characteristic dramatic fashion when he said, "I am not putting hermeneutics forwarded as a successor subject to epistemology. On the contrary, hermeneutics is an expression of hope that the cultural space left by the demise of epistemology will not be filled, assuming that epistemology is indeed dead. In reality, it is far from being dead. It was done in by two lethal bullets, or to use a better imagery, or one cluster bomb with two deadly explosives. The name of the bomb is hermeneutic circle, and its deadly explosive are semantic holism and theory-laden observation. In this unit and the next, we shall put our bomb squad to work, analyze these explosives to see how deadly they are. There, the unit is considered with semantic holism and its limits. We shall see that beyond a point, this explosive is harmless, and the limits of holism are encountered in radical translation interpretation. 1.2 The death of epistemology. If we look into any philosophical journal, we will find that epistemological issues are permanently featured in them. If so, what do the so-called death certificates of epistemology amount to? In order to answer that question, we need to focus on the specifies. Let us focus on Rorty claim. What does he mean by epistemology? Who's there? The proclaims epistemology, of course, is the study of human knowledge, but knowledge could be Understand a broad sense as well as narrow sense. Broadly understood knowledge is the information of which we become aware. Study of knowledge or epistemology would then be seen as the attempt to understand the nature, structure, limits and conditions of our cognitive achievements. When epistemology is understood in this broad sense, even the one who argues the objective knowledge is impossible is engaged in doing epistemology. Epistemology, in other words, is not identical with a positive view regarding the possibility of truth of knowledge upon the broad construal of epistemology. Then it makes no sense to talk of the demise of epistemology. When Rorty talks about the demise of epistemology, he has a narrower view of knowledge and epistemology in mind. Epistemology knowledge is not understood generally in terms of informations, but as justified true belief with much of the discussion on justification. The primary task of epistemology then is like that of an examinations broad testing the candidates to truth called beliefs of propositions and declaring whether the candidates have passed the examination true or not false. We could also say that the epistemological task is to adjudicate between propositions competing for the status of truth, and this is done by means of justifications from the argument of Rorty. It is pretty clear that the takes epistemology in this narrower sense of justifications of beliefs, and his claim is that hermeneutics makes it impossible to pass from belief to knowledge. Just as there is a broad and a narrow way of understanding epistemology, so also there is a broad and narrow way of understanding hermeneutics. In the narrow sense, it stands for that contentious school of philosophy which began with Friedrich Schleiermacher and reinvented itself many times in the work of William Delity, Martin Heidegger and others. Hermeneutics and understood by Rorty, however, does not stand for this contentious development alone. Rather, it is understood broadly as a cumulative thread that challenges the epistemological concern with justification. In this sense, hermeneutics includes, besides the said continental schools, some of the claims made on behalf of the latter philosophy of Wittgenstein traits in sociology of knowledge and post-empiricist philosophy of science, like that of Thomas Kuhn and postmodernism. These varied voices apparently show that epistemology understood on the sense of the tribunal that adjudicates among rival claimants to truth is merely a decaying corpse of yesteryears. 1.3 The argument against epistemology. The various arguments from hermeneutics against epistemology seems to coalesce into a general pattern that contends that the findings of hermeneutics so what we can't have a neutral territory or common ground to stand on and decide on the objectivity of truth. To use the language of Rorty, epistemology proceeds on the assumption that all contributions to a given discourse are commensurable, and hermeneutic struggles against that assumption, and by commensurable he means able to be brought under a set of rules such that the contending sides to a cognitive conflict can reach a national agreement. This set of rules act as a permanent natural framework, a ground that is common to all discourse, which enables that different sides to come upon agreement. The situation is something like this: when the different teams gather in South Africa for the World Cup football. This is already a already a set of rules in place. On this basis of which games are played, and the winners and decided those rules of the game functions as the neutral framework within which agreement on victory and defeat becomes possible. But what would happen if each team were to come with its own different rules? Then it would be impossible to play the game or conduct the World Cup. The claim of incommensurability is something similar. The coming of hermeneutics and the um, um, holistic character of all understanding is said to undermine the possibility of a neutral framework of common set of rules, and therefore the possibility of commensurability of all discourse. We will not be able to isolate basic elements except on this basis of prior knowledge of the whole fabric within which these elements occur. Epistemology is impossible because it seeks agreement on the basis of natural grounds, and a common set of fuels, and hermeneutics tells us that there are such grounds. This is the claim. 1.4 Holism and Hermeneutic Circle. All the heart of this claim of incommensurability lies holism. The basic principle of holism was given by Aristotle in Metaphysics. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. It says that the system of the whole is not determined solely by its components. On the contrary, the system plays an important role in making the parts what they are and the way they behave. There are different kinds of holism. What we have just described is ontological holism, or holism of things. That the kind of holism at work in incommensurability has to do with meaning. Semantic holism and justification. Epistemological holism. For a variety of historical reasons, much contemporary epistemology makes no clear distinction between meaning and truth, understanding and justification. And prima facie, this is an important distinction. There is hardly any difficulty in understanding a statement like there is life on Mars, but understanding that claim does not mean that we have any reason for believing it to be true. In order to believe in it to be true, we need to engage in evidential procedures, that is epistemic justification. Justification requires understanding the statement to be justified, but justifications in this unit we shall focus on semantic holism and leave epistemological holism to the next. In examining semantic holism out, our task would be to examine whether different languages are so incommensurable and to create an unbreakable barrier between them. Semantic holism is about meaning. Let us look at it this way. All of us use language. Language is made up of word and sentences. People reading sentence like this is an orange, Thomas is my uncle, etc. understand what is being said, that is understand their meaning. But how do individual linguistic expressions get their meaning? Do they possess meaning on their own, or do they have meaning only when individual expressions get related to other expressions or to the larger system of language? Semantic holism is the view that individual expressions get their meaning only in relation to the larger whole of which it is a part, apart from the system in which it is a get the meaning only in relation to the larger whole of which is the part. Expressions do not mean anything. We saw this in a connection with Wittgenstein language. Games and expressions like this is king has any meaning only in relations to the whole game of chess and the rules by which that game is played. Independently of that system of rules, the wooden piece on a chessboard can't be understood king. can be occupied in a system of language, and the rules of that system in the language of an analytic philosophy. Meaning of an expression is constituted by language, L of which is E is part. Therefore, in order to grasp the meaning of E, one must already be familiar with L. The relationship between the part and the whole is also basic connections contentions of hermeneutic circle. Hermeneutic circle is a vision of holism coming from a completely different philosophical tradition. Expect that hermeneutics talks more about understanding that about meaning. Probing the process of understanding. Hermeneutic thinkers come to the conclusion that any understanding is dependent on pre-understanding. This is almost identical the claim just made that the meaning of an individual expression is constituted by the language came L of which it as a part. Hermeneutic circle understood in this fashion is a vision of semantic holism. It helps us that understanding is always as an inside job. Only a person with the requisite pre-understanding is in a position to understand. At one level, hermeneutic circle makes unaware of an obvious truism that is at work in any and every instance of understanding. Take an example. Imagine a situation where a non-specialist walks into a conference of specialists, say of microbiology, of quantum physics, or even some technical philosophy. Our visitor hears words being uttered, diagrams being drawn, and so on, but can make no sense of what is going on. Whereas the specialists present in the room follow the arguments and the discussions. The difference between the one who understands the one who does not is that the one who understands has the requisite linguistic and conceptual resources pre-understanding, whereas the other one lacks the needed resources understanding. In other words, is indeed an inside affair. Only the one who has the requisite pre-understanding is able to understand, and not the outsider. Hermeneutic circle is also tells us something more. It makes us realize that understanding is not the collapse of some static thing called meaning. Understanding rather is a dynamic process that could take place at various levels. A person with a minimal pre-understanding will have a annual understanding, whereas another with greater uh, pre-understanding will have greater understanding. Richard Rorty gives us a good example when he tells us that coming to understand is more like getting acquainted with a person that like following a demonstrations. In both there is a back and forth between guesses about how to categorize particular statements or other events and guesses about the point of whole situation. Certain casually be feel at else with what was hit retro stage. Yes, this constant back this constant back and forth between the particular part and the whole leads another example. If a beginner were trying to understand the technical parts of the philosophy of W.B. Quine, of the Queen, or Donald Davidson by some directly to one of their more technical works, the text would remain largely opaque to the person. On the other hand, someone with some familiarity with the other works as a whole will have will have some understanding of the present text that is difficult. That familiarity with one text in turn helps the person to have a better grasp of the whole philosophy of the author. This increased understanding of the whole philosophy in turn enables the person who to understand even more difficult parts, and so on. The process continuous hermeneutic circle, in other words, tells us that understanding is a spiraling depending process where the greater one's familiarity with the whole, the greater the grasp of the parts, and vice versa. The greater the pre-understanding, the greater the understanding. This back and forth between the forth between the parts and the whole makes us aware of the possibility of progressive understanding. In this respect, hermeneutic circle tell us something more than semantic holism. It tells us that understanding is the dynamic circular process whereby the whole illumine the parts, and the whole in turn is understand in term of its parts. 1.5 The limits of holism. The limits of holism: the fact that semantic holism and hermeneutic circle involve circularity. Circularity raises a problem. How does one get into the circle? It grasping the meaning of he in language E requires familiarity with L. How does one acquire language L in the first place? How does one acquire a new language if every understanding is dependent on a prior understanding? How does one acquire that first pre-understanding? Will hermeneutic circle does not answer this. Problem of language acquisition. It does tell us that understanding is not an all or nothing affair, but a matter of degrees that can vary from having no understanding to having a perfect understanding. On the one extreme are those with no pre-understanding, and hence do not understanding at all, like the outsider in a specialists conference. In our earlier example, on the other extreme, there are those with the maximal pre-understanding who understand the uh, proceedings best. Circle does not answer this. 1.5 The limits of holism. The fact that semantic holism and hermeneutic circle involve circularity raises a problem. How does one get into the circle? It grasping the meaning of E in language L requires familiarity with L. How does one acquire language L and the first place? How does one acquire a new language if very understanding is dependent on a prior understanding? How does one acquire that first pre-understanding? Will hermeneutic circle does not answer this. Problem of language acquisition. It does tell us that understanding is not an all or nothing affair, but a matter of degrees that can vary from having no understanding to having a perfect understanding. On the one extreme are those are those with no pre-understanding and hence do not understand at all, like the outsider in a specialist conference in our earlier example. On the other extreme, there are those with the maximal pre-understanding who understand the proceedings based. Our example also make us aware of the limits of semantic holism and hermeneutic circle. If someone uh, with no background in physics were to talk into a conference that discuss the latest theories in that field, our outsider will obviously not understand the matter under discussions. On the other hand, no person in principle is denied access to understand that discourse. Someone who has no knowledge of physics can be introduced it to beginning with some of its rudimentary concept and eventually proceeding to more advanced theories, such that eventually the person can be brought to understand and participate in the conference of the physicist. The fact that an outsider can become an insider, one who lacks the requisite pre-understanding and can eventually acquire it, so that hermeneutic circle is not a closed circle. It is as if the circle begins to straighten out at certain point, and the semantic fortress opens its gates to the outsider. What we need to find out is the point at which the circle begins to straighten and where the gates of the fortress are located. Those gates are to be found in the observation sentences as conceived by W. V. Quinn in this theory of radical translation. Let us recapitulate the underli- uh, undeniable facts about understanding. First, there is semantic holism. The meaning of an individual expression is to be found in the system on the whole of which that expression is a part. In other words, all understanding is dependent on some pre-understanding. It is always an inside affair. Second, understanding is not a is not a static all or nothing affair, but a dynamic process that shuttles back and forth between and parts and the whole. Therefore, understanding can vary from complete lack of understanding to perfect understanding. Third, hermeneutic circle is not a closed circle. Through all, understanding is all inside affair. No one is excluded in principle from entering into the circle. All these three factors need to be taken into account by a good theory of understanding. 1.6 Radical Translation Interpretation. Willard Van Orman Cohen (1908 to 2000) is one of the most influential American philosophers of the 20th century who helped us to rethink the way we conceive of the relationship between language and the world. Coming from the empiricist analytic tradition, he came to be known first for his attack on empiricism with his essay Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Although coming from the Anglo-American analytic traditions with its strong emphasis on formal logic, his advocate of holism as opposed to the atomism to the earlier empiricist shows affinities between has analytic philosophy and the hermeneutic thinking of the continental tradition, but there is a difference even while criticizing the atomism of the logical empiricist. He maintains his affinity with their scientific learnings, especially their fascinations with the scientific procedures and its reliance on logic and observations. Because he is critical of the atomism to the earlier empiricist, he is faced with a question like the one we have raised. How does one acquire a new language, or how does one change one's status from being an outsider to an insider? Although Quinn does not raise the questions in these terms, the kind of situation he describes in Radical Translation is relevant to our questions. Radical Translation is a thought experiment conceived by Quinn in the 1950s. It places us in a setting where a linguist has to translate into his native language, say English, the language of some heteroto unknown tribe. Their language Cohen called it jungle is not historically or culturally related to any known language. It is further assumed that the linguistic has no access to any bilingual first in English and jungle, and that there are no translation manuals available via the linguistic equivalents of words from jungle to English. Or vice versa can be found. These features of the thought experiment are very important because it is these that make the translation radical. It is like learning a completely new language with no teacher with no teacher and no books to fall back upon understanding understanding radical translations. All that our field linguistic has to go by it is the behavior books of the jungle speakers in publicly recognizable circumstances. For example, a rabbit squeals by and the jungle speaker utters gavagai. From this, the linguistic suspects that the utterance is promoted by the appearance of rabbit, and he tentatively concludes that the utterance "gavagai" is to be taken as a one-word sentence and translated as "lo a rabbit" or "here is a rabbit" in English, but the radical translator can really be sure it could be the rabbit, It could be the running of the rabbit, a part of the rabbit, or any number of other things. But from his later interaction with the native or similar occasions, he is eventually confirmed or disconfirmed in his view that Gabhagai means low a rabbit. These latter occasions would include situations with when the linguistic could quiz the native Gabhagai with the in intentions of electing the natives as ascents or descent. The linguistic notes the natives utterance of Gavagai vary in the natives positions might have said rabbit and looks to natives for approval. Encouraged, he tentatively adopts rabbit as translation. It is only after a process of sufficient trial and error that the linguist is able to conclude that Gabhagai means lower rabbit. The original point of the discussions on radical translations was to show the indeterminacy of meaning. Donald Davidson used to the same thought experiment with a different emphasis, called it radical interpretations. Both the theories, radical translations and interpretations, and their implications are extensively debated, and the debates still continue. Moreover, Quinn himself has changed the details of the history. Those detailed and often technical debates are not important for our purpose of answering whether the utterances of a completely aligned community can be accessed by an outsider, but a little background can help us understand their positions. For the logical positivist, observation was the cornerstone of their thinking. It provided evidence for theories as well as the foundations of meaning. Since it was so central to everything else, they set out finding rigorous criteria for identifying it, and talked in terms of the pure given in observation as opposed to all that the observer brings to it, such as concepts that enter into our reports of observation. The rest of language gets its meaning from the pure given, which was supposed to be fixed. Eventually they came to the realization that pure given is a myth while freed sellers. Coins, this is about the indeterminacy of meaning, must be seen in this background of the visit attempts to fix the meaning of observation sentences in terms of the given experience. The idea is that publicly observable evidence could be interpreted in every different ways. The publicly observable factors in the given example are the physical stimuli of the rabbit, the verbal stimuli from the native Gabhagai, but this slender evidence could be used to translate Gabhagai in different ways. As we have noted, this was Cohen's point in proposing the experiment. Neither Quinn nor Davidson leaves us in any doubt that the utterance of an utterly aligned community can be accessed by an outsider, although it is not easy and involves a long process. Davidson, in one of these well-known articles on the very idea of conceptual scheme, even argues explicitly against radical different or incommensurable systems of beliefs. In discussing radical translation interpretations, we will be concerned only with this common with inside that in the insight that in spite of semantic holism, different languages and cultures are not completely incapable to one another. Seen in terms of accessibility to a radically aligned language community, we do not even have to think of it as it as a thought experiment. It is something that has been done many times in the past by pioneering explorers and jealous missionaries who made totally aligned languages and cultures their own. Their first attempts had the characteristic features of the situation that Cohen describes. Only after their pioneering efforts at radical translations could any translation manuals and bilingual dictionaries come into existence. It is only in our contemporary globalist village, where hardly any language or culture remains radically aligned, we have to think of radical translation interpretation as a thought experiment. 1.7 Observation sentences. The key to radical translation interpretation is to be found in observation sentence. As the name indicates, observation sentences are reports of observation. Although Quinn has given up the earlier visions of empiricism, he still finds the need to give some special status of observation. One of the reasons that prompts him to give this special status is the fact it is possible to learn a new language irrespective of whether it is by the radical translator or the child learning this first language. Observation sentence, he says, are the infant's entry to language for much the same reason they are the radical translator way into the jungle language. Observation sentences can do this job because they have some special features. First of all, they are somehow more directly linked to the world than the theoretical language, and therefore free of the indeterminacies that beset the translations of theoretical sentence, and can be learned by ostensions that is pointing to things that they are strongly conditioned to current sensory stimulations rather than to stored collateral information. We must make a qualifications here. As an advocate holism, he is perfectly aware that all observation are not of this kind. Therefore, he speaks about degrees of observationality. Some observation sentences contain more collectoral information than others. He illustrates a chemist learns about compounds of copper in the course of his reading and experiments, and a physician learns about the facial symptoms of an overactive thyroid. In due course, the one comes to recognize the presence of copper by a glance at the solutions, and the other to recognize hyperthyroidism by a glance at the patients. The sentence "there was a copper in it" has become an observation sentence for the one, and he is a hyperthyroid for the other. Such learning by the chemist and the physician is a later development. For this later development to take place, there must be some observation sentences that are more primitive sentences that are keyed directly to a range of perceptually fairly similar global stimuli. It is this fairly pure case observation that are necessary for radical translations. Only they can function as the child's port of entry into a language. Cohen's examples of pure observation sentences include it is cold, it is raining, that's milk, that's a dog. A second characteristic of such pure observation sentence is that they are universal. They could be said to be universal in two senses. First, they are universal to the speakers of a language. This would exclude the kind of specialized collectoral information available to the chemist and the physicians in the above example. Second, they can also be said to be universal to our species. They are the common coin shared reference point, says Quinn, but we must not take this universality to mean that the words of any particular language are universal. That is obviously false. Rather, it should be understood as pointing to an evolutionary heritage whereby we cluster the We cluster the stimuli received from the environment in certain ways and not in other ways, so that we identify, recognize, and classify what we perceive in certain characteristically human ways. This connects us to a third characteristic of pure observation sentence. In sentences, according to Quinn, they are the human counterpart of animal cries, just as the animals have repertories of distinctive calls and cries of altering one another to the distinctive dangers and opportunities. So do we if our observation sentence are the human counterpart of animal cries. This must be innate to us, but Cohen does not use the language of in intense in he talks of it as a pre-established in intersubjective harmony at the bottom of which lies instinct and natural selection. In other words, at the most primitive levels of our perceptual interactions with our natural surroundings, we do have some common pre-understanding that is a part of our evolutionary heritage as a species. There is nothing terribly exciting about any of these characteristics of observation sentences, but together the three link to the world of extra linguistic reality, universality, and in sentences make it possible for us to cross over to different language, cultures, and conceptual schemes. They enable complete strangers to enter into the kingdom of understanding absolutely aligned languages and cultures, that thereby extravagant claims of incommensurability are shown to be unwarranted. Does the possibility of radical translation undermine the basic insight of the hermeneutic circle that understanding is always an inside job? Not at all. Otherwise, there would be no need for the radical translator to get the ascent or descent of the native to the questions Gabhagai. All that radical translation does is to open up an entry port to the outsider, although the entry port is kept open to the outsider. It is the insider, the native, who decides whether the outsider qualifies to enter. The outsider can apply, but the insider issues the visa. The insider makes the judgment as the whether radical translator has understood his language correctly. In this way, radical translation opens up an entry point to the outsider without undermining the hermeneutic character of all understanding.